Hey there, sleepyheads. Welcome back to the channel. Before we drift into tonight's tale of the slow history of rings, I'd love to know where in the world are you watching from tonight? And what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. It's always magical seeing how far and wide this sleepy little community reaches. All right, lights low, blankets up, let's begin. Long before heroes ran across emerald fields, before cities rose and machines stirred the silence of the earth, the world was quiet. It was not empty, but it was still. Oceans breathed in slow tides. Mountains lay heavy and undisturbed. Forests stretched endlessly, whispering in the wind. And within this silence, the very energy of the world pulsed, gentle, unseen, eternal. It was from this rhythm, this heartbeat of the earth itself, that the first golden sparks were born. They did not fall from the sky like meteor. They did not rise from the ocean like forgotten relics. Instead, they shimmered into being, tiny fragments of light, curved into perfect circles, rings. At first they were few, scattered in hidden groves, resting in shallow caves, caught between roots of ancient trees. To the world itself, they were a release of excess life energy, small ripples of creation made visible. The same pulse that gave birth to oceans and skies now shaped something more delicate, more mysterious. When animals first discovered them, they did not understand. Birds carried them in their beaks, only for the rings to vanish in a gentle shimmer of light. Small creatures stumbled across them and felt a fleeting warmth, a protection against hunger and fear. The rings were never meant to be owned. They were never meant to stay. They appeared, offered safety, and faded when the balance was restored. It was in this way that the earliest myths began. Tribes of the ancients, long before written history, wandered into sacred valleys where rings gathered like dew. The tribes would sit in silence as the rings glowed faintly around them, shimmering in the moonlight, golden halos hovering just above the grass. They believed them to be the breath of the gods, a gift from the unseen forces that shaped the world. One legend tells of a child who wandered alone into a storm. Lightning split the sky and winds tore through the forest. The child stumbled and fell, but as the storm raged, rings began to form around them, glimmering in the darkness. Each one seemed to shield the child from harm until the storm passed. When the tribe found the child the next morning, the rings were gone, but not the protection they had given. From that day, rings were no longer seen as strange lights, but as guardians. The ancients began to leave offerings near the places where rings appeared most often. They carved stone circles in honor of the golden ones, and they sang low hymns in the evenings, hoping the rings would remain with them. They could not catch them. They could not keep them. The rings belonged to the world, and the world alone decided when and where they would appear. And yet their mystery grew deeper. The ancients noticed that rings did not appear in times of peace. They appeared in moments of trial, when storms raged, when darkness threatened, when chaos drew near. It was as though the rings sensed the fragile balance of life and rose to defend it. In this, the ancients believed they had found a truth. Rings were not simply gold. They were life itself, woven into shape, ready to protect all who needed them. Over time, the rings began to take on roles in ritual and story. In the oldest temples, worn carvings can still be seen. Spirals of gold etched into stone, circles repeating endlessly across walls and pillars. Some believe these spirals were not mere decoration, but prayers. Each circle was an invocation, a plea for the rings to bless the people, to shield them from harm. In one ruin, long buried beneath sand and vines, there is a tablet so weathered it is almost unreadable. On it, a figure stands surrounded by circles of gold. Their arms are raised as though reaching for the heavens. Scholars who have studied the markings call this the keeper of the first spark, a figure that may never have existed, but who lived on in myth as the first one to truly understand the meaning of rings. But what was that meaning? The ancients could not agree. Some believed the rings were fragments of the stars falling gently onto the earth. Others believed they were the tears of the planet itself shimmering into existence when pain or danger struck. And still others whispered that the rings were born of chaos energy, the same power that flowed through the mighty chaos emeralds. This last belief held the greatest weight, for the ancients often found rings in places where energy surged strongest. Near waterfalls, near mountain peaks, near hidden caves where the very air seemed to hum. And in the presence of chaos emeralds, rings seemed to gather more abundantly, as though drawn toward their larger, more powerful counterparts. It was here that another mystery arose. When one gathered a ring, it vanished, not destroyed, not broken, simply gone, as though absorbed into the one who touched it. The ancients described the sensation as a warmth in the chest, a lightness in the body, a sudden clarity of thought. It was as if the ring merged with the soul, lending its strength to the bearer for only a short while. And then, just as suddenly, that strength could be lost, rings scattering from the body in moments of harm or fear. Thus began the paradox of rings, eternal yet fleeting, infinite yet fragile. They could shield life, but only for as long as one could hold them. The ancients saw this paradox not as a flaw, but as a lesson. They believed the rings taught them humility, that no protection lasted forever, and no gift could be hoarded. Rings came and went like the wind, reminding all who encountered them that safety was never permanent, only borrowed. And so, slowly, the rings became not only objects of protection, but symbols of the eternal cycle of life. To walk among them was to be reminded of the delicate balance that held the world together. To touch them was to know that even in moments of danger, light would always rise again. The world changed slowly in those ancient days, and with it, the stories of the rings deepened. Among the oldest tales whispered around fires, there was one often told in hushed voices, as though the rings themselves were listening. It was said that the very first ring, the original spark from which all others were born, still lingered somewhere in the world. Unlike the countless rings that appeared and disappeared, this one was permanent, a circle of gold that never faded. The legend claimed it rested within the heart of a mountain, its glow eternal, untouched by time. The ancients called it the root ring, the source from which all other rings sprang. Some believed that whoever found it would never know harm again. Others warned that such power was not meant for mortal hands, and that the mountain would collapse before the ring allowed itself to be taken. Whether it was real or only myth, the story spread across generations, shaping the way people viewed the smaller, fleeting rings. If a permanent one existed, then perhaps each lesser ring was a fragment of that eternal source, droplets of golden light spilling out into the world. But no one ever found the root ring, and so its story remained only that, a story. Even without it, the rings were woven into daily life. They became markers of safety. Travelers would speak of journeys across dangerous valleys, where rings scattered along the path like stars. To see rings on the road was to know the world was watching, offering silent guidance. To see none was to feel unease, as though one had stepped too far beyond the balance of things. And yet, rings were never predictable. they could vanish as quickly as they appeared. Some travelers swore that the rings responded to emotion, that when courage burned in one's chest, rings would gather more readily, as though drawn to the flame of will. Others insisted they responded to fear, appearing when danger pressed close, as a last mercy to shield the fragile spark of life. No one truly understood their laws, and perhaps that was why they remained so mysterious. It was not long before artists and storytellers began to use rings as symbols in their work. On ancient pottery, figures are painted reaching for circles of gold, their hands outstretched toward something they cannot hold. On faded murals, warriors stand surrounded by rings, their bodies haloed by glowing orbs, suggesting protection and strength. Even the simplest carvings on stone tools often carried circles etched into them, not for decoration, but as charms, invoking the presence of rings in the lives of those who used them. Over time, some tribes began to see rings not only as protection, but as a bridge between the mortal and the eternal. Their round shape, endless with no beginning and no end, spoke of cycles, of life, death, and rebirth. To hold a ring, even for a moment, was to touch that eternal rhythm. One ancient hymn, preserved only in fragments, describes it like this: gold that vanishes yet returns, gold that falls yet rises, gold that is lost yet never gone. The ancients sang these words when they feared the world was slipping into chaos. They sang them when storms blackened the skies, when rivers threatened to overflow, when the shadows of beasts loomed close. And often, after such hymns, rings were said to appear, scattered across the ground, glowing faintly as though answering the plea. Perhaps it was coincidence, perhaps not. But the belief that the world responded to the cries of its people only deepened their reverence for the rings. They became more than objects. They became signs, moments of reassurance, that even when the world grew hostile, something gentle still lingered, watching quietly from the unseen spaces. As centuries passed, the rings began to appear in stories of heroes, too. Long before Sonic raced across the hills, there were other nameless figures half forgotten by time. Legends speak of hunters who wandered too far into dark forests, pursued by beasts larger than life. Just when their strength faltered, rings surrounded them, golden shields against the claws that would have ended their lives. Others tell of warriors who stood against the rise of fire, their homes threatened by molten rivers, and how rings gathered around them, allowing them to survive where none else could. It is in these stories that we see the earliest echoes of the bond between rings and those destined for extraordinary paths. The ancients began to whisper that rings chose their guardians, that only those whose journeys carried weight in the flow of history would be truly protected. And yet, for all their reverence, the ancients never stopped fearing the fragile nature of rings. They knew too well how easily they could scatter, how quickly they could be lost. It was said that when a person dropped their last ring, they stood at the very edge of life itself, unguarded against the chaos of the world. This fear shaped rituals of mourning. In some tribes, when one passed away, golden circles were drawn in the dirt around their resting place, symbols of rings drawn by hand. They believed this helped guide the spirit onward, ensuring it was not lost in the void between life and what lay beyond. In other places, they buried smooth stones carved into rings beside the dead, as if to offer them protection in the unknown journey ahead. Thus, rings came to embody not only life's fleeting protection, but also the hope of something beyond, a cycle unbroken even by death. And still, the mystery endured. Rings never aged. Rings never cracked or withered. A ring discovered one day was as flawless as any found centuries later, gleaming with the same golden glow. They belonged to no age, no single people, no fleeting empire. They simply existed, eternal yet ephemeral, scattered endlessly, appearing and disappearing like dreams half remembered. The ancients lived and died with this mystery unsolved. And perhaps that was the point. Rings were not meant to be solved. They were meant to be experienced, held briefly, felt deeply, and then released back into the flow of the world. The world is old, far older than any tribe or hero who ever walked its surface. And the rings, though small, belong to that deep age. To speak of them is to speak of the first light that broke through the shadows of creation. Among the most enduring myths passed down through time, there is one that tells of how the rings were not shaped by chance, nor by the world's idle whim, but by intention. It is said that the planet itself, the great living force that breathes through oceans and sky, created them as a safeguard. Where chaos energy surged too sharply, where imbalance threatened to unravel the weave of life, rings would appear to soften the blow. They were like stitches in a vast tapestry, mending what was torn, holding together what might otherwise collapse. In this vision, the rings were not random gifts, but deliberate guardians, placed gently along the pathways of history. Every time a ring appeared in the grass, every time one shimmered in the ruins of a temple or hovered above stone and soil, it was the world itself speaking, offering its hand. But another story paints them differently. In that telling, the rings are fragments of lost perfection. Once the universe was whole, its energy seamless and unbroken. But when chaos entered the weave, the perfect fabric was torn, scattering shards of golden light across time and space. Those shards became the rings, imperfect echoes of what once was. And so they flicker in and out of existence, never permanent, because they themselves are incomplete. They remind the world of what was lost and of what cannot be fully restored. Whether gift or fragment, the rings carried meaning far beyond their glow. To hold even one was to step into the flow of these stories, to carry with you the whispers of creation itself. The ancients noticed patterns that deepened their wonder. Rings did not merely scatter in places of danger. They often gathered in paths, long lines curving through valleys and forests. To them, this was proof that the rings were not random at all, but purposeful. The paths were guides, invisible roads laid down by forces unseen. Some followed them and found safety. Others followed them and vanished into places no one returned from. Still, the belief remained. The rings led somewhere, even if that destination was beyond the understanding of mortals. Scholars of later ages looked back on these myths with fascination. Were the rings conscious? Did they choose their place in the world? Or were they simply energy obeying hidden laws? No answer satisfied everyone. Even in times of great knowledge, the mystery remained untouched. Perhaps it was this very unknowability that made them so enchanting. For every tale of rings as guardians, there were darker stories too. Some whispered of rings that would not vanish when gathered, but instead clung to their bearer, never letting go. These rings were said to drain the life of their host, feeding endlessly until the golden glow turned pale and cold. Whether these were only cautionary tales, or whether such rings ever truly existed, no one can say. But the fear they inspired added to the reverence. The rings were not to be taken lightly. They were gifts, but not possessions. And so, as the centuries turned, the world moved forward, yet the rings remained the same. Generations passed like seasons. Empires rose and fell. Their monuments crumbled to dust. The oceans shifted. The skies grew heavy with storms. The stars themselves wheeled through the heavens, and still the rings glimmered on the earth, unchanged. This timelessness gave them an aura of eternity. Children grew old and returned to the soil, but the rings they once touched still appeared for others to find. To some, this was comforting, that the rings would outlast all mortal struggles, that they would always be there, waiting. To others, it was humbling. The rings were not theirs, not anyone's. They belonged only to the endless cycle, beyond the reach of ownership. Imagine walking alone in the twilight of an ancient forest. The air is heavy with silence, broken only by the distant call of unseen creatures. The path is uneven, tangled with roots, the canopy above shutting out all but faint threads of moonlight. And then you see it, floating just ahead, a circle of gold, glowing softly in the darkness. No sound accompanies it. No warmth radiates from it. And yet it pulls you forward like a memory half forgotten. You reach out, and as your fingers brush its edge, it vanishes. In its place, a quiet calm settles in your chest, as though the forest itself has acknowledged you. That is the gift of the ring, fleeting but real. The ancients would have said that in such a moment, the world was reminding you of your place in its rhythm, that your journey, no matter how small, mattered. The ring appeared not by chance, but because you were meant to see it. This idea that rings appear where they are needed most has echoed through all ages. From nameless hunters to great heroes, from wandering tribes to the fastest hedgehog alive, the rings have remained constant. They are not tied to one story, one people, or one age. They are threads that weave through them all, shimmering in and out, eternal and ephemeral. And though they vanish in a blink, they always return. Somewhere, sometime, they reappear, waiting to be gathered again. This endless cycle, the rise, the loss, the return, became the truest meaning of the rings. They are not permanence. They are renewal. To hold a ring is to borrow safety, but also to remember that nothing is ever truly lost. Just as rings scatter when one is struck down, so too do they return when strength is found again. In this way, they mirror life itself. We stumble, we fall, we are broken. But still, the spark returns, the golden circle reappears, and the journey continues. The first spark was not merely the creation of gold. It was the promise that no fall is final, no darkness eternal. The rings carry that promise, silent and unchanging, across every age of the world. And so chapter 1 closes not with an ending, but with a circle, like the rings themselves. A reminder that the story has no true beginning and no true end. It only flows, unbroken, from one bearer to the next, one age to the next, one life to the next. The first spark still lingers, scattered in countless rings across the land, waiting quietly for the hands that will gather them, lose them, and gather them again. Chapter 2. The Age of Temples. Time moved forward, though the world itself seemed timeless. The ancients who first whispered about the first spark eventually passed into memory, but their reverence for the rings did not fade. Instead, it grew stronger, shaping not only their beliefs, but their cities, their art, and the very stones they placed upon one another. Where rings gathered most often, people built their temples. The earliest shrines were simple, circles of carved stone placed in valleys on mountaintops or beside rivers that shimmered with an unusual hum of energy. They were not grand, nor meant to impress. They were places of stillness, spaces where one could wait quietly and watch for the rings to appear. Some tribes called these places listening grounds, for they believed the rings were not only light, but voice, the world's way of speaking, if one was patient enough to hear. Over centuries, these humble circles grew into great structures. Pillars rose high above the earth, carved with endless spirals that mimicked the roundness of the rings. Walls were etched with golden paint, the pigments carefully mixed from rare minerals so that when the sun struck them at dawn or dusk, they seemed to shimmer as if alive. Inside these temples, the air was cool and heavy with silence. Torches were kept dim, not to disturb the glow of rings that sometimes appeared in the center chambers. When they did, priests and guardians would kneel in reverence, hands clasped, as the golden circles hovered in the air like visiting spirits. No one dared touch them unless it was necessary. To gather a ring in a temple was seen. Time moved forward, though the world itself seemed timeless. The ancients who first whispered about the first spark eventually passed into memory, but their reverence for the rings did not fade. Instead, it grew stronger, shaping not only their beliefs, but their cities, their art, and the very stones they placed upon one another. Where rings gathered most often, people built their temples. The earliest shrines were simple, circles of carved stone placed in valleys on mountaintops or beside rivers that shimmered with an unusual hum of energy. They were not grand, nor meant to impress. They were places of stillness, spaces where one could wait quietly and watch for the rings to appear. Some tribes called these places listening grounds, for they believed the rings were not only light, but voice, the world's way of speaking, if one was patient enough to hear. Over centuries, these humble circles grew into great structures. Pillars rose high above the earth, carved with endless spirals that mimicked the roundness of the rings. Walls were etched with golden paint, the pigments carefully mixed from rare minerals so that when the sun struck them at dawn or dusk, they seemed to shimmer as if alive. Inside these temples, the air was cool and heavy with silence. Torches were kept dim, not to disturb the glow of rings that sometimes appeared in the center chambers. When they did, priests and guardians would kneel in reverence, hands clasped, as the golden circles hovered in the air like visiting spirits. No one dared touch them unless it was necessary. To gather a ring in a temple was seen as both a blessing and a burden, for it meant the world had chosen you. The temples themselves became maps of faith. In some, the floors were arranged in long, winding paths of stone, circular patterns leading to a central altar. Worshippers walked these paths slowly, barefoot, retracing the shape of the ring with each careful step. To walk the circle was to imitate the eternal rhythm of the rings, to live the truth that there is no beginning and no end. It is said that in one temple, hidden now in a forgotten forest, the walls themselves would glow faintly when rings appeared inside. Visitors described the light not as fire, but as something softer, like moonlight trapped in the stone. They believed the rings had seeped into the very structure, fusing with the stone until the temple itself became half alive, a breathing monument to the world's energy. And always the carvings spoke of protection. Across ruined walls that still stand today, one can see figures drawn within circles, their arms raised high as if shielded by golden halos. Above them, beasts loom, serpents, fire, waves, but the circles hold unbroken around the fragile figures. These carvings told a story to all who entered, that no darkness, no chaos, no storm was stronger than the shield of the rings. But not all temples spoke only of safety. Some whispered of the fragility of this protection. In certain ruins, one finds carvings of broken rings, circles shattered, spirals unraveling. These were warnings, reminders that to rely too much upon the rings was to misunderstand them. They could protect, yes, but they were never endless. They were a gift borrowed, not a treasure owned. Priests of the temples taught that the rings carried 3 lessons. The first was humility, to know that protection could vanish at any moment. The second was gratitude, to treasure the fleeting gift of safety while it lasted. And the third was balance, to walk carefully, for only in balance did the rings appear at all. Legends say that those who defied these lessons, those who sought to hoard rings within the temples, gathering them greedily, were cursed. Not by the priests, not even by the gods they prayed to, but by the rings themselves. The rings would vanish from their sight, never to return, no matter where they walked. Such people wandered in despair, traveling through dangerous lands without a single circle of gold to guide them. And so the temples became not only places of worship, but also of warning. Their walls told stories of triumph and tragedy alike, reminding all who entered that the rings were as fragile as they were eternal. Yet even with this fragility, the people's devotion did not waver. Entire cities began to form around great temples. Markets bustled nearby, filled with traders who sold golden charms shaped like rings, small reminders of protection for everyday life. Children played games where they drew circles in the dirt and leapt through them, laughing as though they were leaping through real rings. Even in the most ordinary days, the rings were present in thought, in symbol, in story. When travelers returned from distant lands, their first stories were not of rivers or mountains, but of whether rings had guided their way. Did they appear in times of storm? Did they vanish at the edge of a cliff? Did they shine in caves where no sun reached? To hear of rings was to hear of the world itself, alive and attentive, watching each step of mortal life. And in this way, the age of temples was not merely an age of stone and ritual. It was an age where the rings became the center of life's rhythm, shaping the faith of countless generations. As temples grew larger, their reach spread across distant lands. Each civilization carved its own meaning into the rings, yet all returned to the same golden circle. It was as if the symbol of the ring was planted deep in the memory of the world itself, so that no matter how far people wandered, they could not forget it. In coastal cities, temples rose above cliffs, facing the endless ocean. Here, worshippers believed rings were born from the horizon, carried on the wind like salt, shimmering into being where sea and sky touched. The temple floors were carved with wave-like patterns, spirals upon spirals, their edges gilded with gold dust. When the sun set, the spirals caught the light, glowing faintly as though the rings themselves were woven to the stone. Sailors came here before long voyages, kneeling before the altars to ask that rings would guide them across storms. They carried small golden circles tied to their belts, charms to call upon protection if the sea grew cruel. Far inland, desert tribes built temples that rose like needles from the sand. In the scorching heat of day, the golden stones shimmered so brightly they looked like floating rings themselves, blazing above the dunes. These temples taught that rings were not gifts of the sea or sky, but of the sun, the eternal fire that circled each day, burning and returning, endless in its rhythm. Priests here taught that to walk through life was to walk through fire, and only the golden rings could soften its trial. Travelers crossed the desert with faith that somewhere along the sands, rings would appear, shimmering like oases, offering strength to endure. High in the mountains, other temples were carved directly into cliffsides, hidden among clouds and snow. The thin air was said to hum faintly, vibrating with unseen energy. Pilgrims climbed treacherous paths for weeks to reach these heights, believing that rings appeared here in purer forms, untouched by the chaos of the lowlands. They described the rings as brighter, their glow sharper, their presence almost overwhelming. It was believed that here, so close to the heavens, one could see the rings not only as shields, but as windows into eternity. Across all these lands, no two temples were alike, yet all shared one truth. The rings were central. The Age of Temples was a time of faith, but it was also a time of deepening mystery. The more people studied the rings, the less they seemed to understand. Some believed that by aligning temples with the stars, they could predict where rings would appear. Others studied the hum of energy in the stones, believing they could harness it, trap rings within sacred chambers for later use. But again and again, the rings defied control. They slipped away like water through fingers, appearing only when the world willed it. This defiance gave birth to humility. Kings and queens, rich with wealth, could build the grandest temples of stone and gold, but still they could not command the rings. A peasant walking alone through a forest might see them more often than a ruler in their palace. The rings bent to no authority, no crown, no coin. They appeared where they were needed, not where they were demanded. One story tells of a proud king who ordered his priests to summon rings into his hall. He commanded them to fill his treasury with circles of gold, to hoard them as proof of his greatness. For months they tried, building altars, chanting hymns, burning endless offerings, but not a single ring appeared. The king grew furious and declared the rings false, the faith of his people foolish. That very night a storm rose, tearing through the kingdom with winds so strong that towers crumbled. When the dust cleared, survivors found rings scattered across the broken streets, but none near the palace. To the people, this was proof. The rings had abandoned their arrogant king, choosing instead to protect the weak. Such stories spread quickly, shaping belief. Rings were not for power. They were not for wealth. They were for survival, for the fragile spark of life itself. As the Age of Temples continued, rituals became more elaborate. At festivals, great circles were drawn on the ground, large enough for dozens to stand within. Participants would gather inside, chanting low and slow, their voices echoing in rhythm like the heartbeat of the earth. They called this walking the circle. As they moved in unison, some swore rings would appear above their heads, glowing faintly before vanishing again. Whether real or imagined, the sight filled them with awe, a reminder that the rings were always near, even if unseen. Children, too, were given small rings carved from wood or bone. They wore them as pendants, tokens of safety. When they grew old enough, these pendants were cast into rivers or buried in the earth, returning the symbol to the world. This ritual reminded families that rings were not to be kept forever. They were borrowed, then given back. And yet, devotion carried a shadow. For all the reverence and humility, there were those who sought to bend the rings to darker ends. In remote places, hidden cults formed, believing that if one could gather enough rings at once, they could ascend beyond mortality, stepping into the eternal cycle itself. They built secret altars and sought out places where rings appeared most often, trying to force their presence with forbidden rites. Legends say some succeeded, gathering rings in unnatural numbers, but their triumph never lasted. The rings scattered violently, shattering their bodies into light before vanishing. These stories, whether true or not, served as warnings passed down through generations. To misuse the rings was to invite destruction. Thus, even in the Age of Temples, when the rings were at the center of faith and life, the same paradox endured. Rings were eternal, yet fleeting, protective, yet fragile, gentle, yet untamable. And in that paradox lay their greatest mystery, one that temples could not solve, no matter how high their walls rose or how bright their golden altars gleamed. The age of temples eventually grew into its height, a golden period where nearly every city, every tribe, every distant village kept a shrine to the rings. Wherever travelers went, they would find walls etched with circles, altars glittering faintly, and stories whispered of the golden light. The rings had become not just part of life, but part of identity. And yet, as with all things that rise, there came a slow unraveling. It began quietly, almost invisibly, like the faint crack in a temple's stone wall. A generation was born that no longer remembered the first awe of discovery. To them, rings were simply there, part of the world's rhythm. They still prayed, still lit candles in spiraling halls, but their devotion softened. Rituals that once filled nights with wonder became mere custom, performed out of duty rather than reverence. In this shift, questions emerged. Why, people wondered, must temples stand so tall? Why must offerings be endless? If rings were eternal and free, why should priests claim to speak for them? Slowly, faith turned to doubt, and doubt turned to unrest. The priests tried to tighten their grip. They spoke louder, warning of curses and disasters should the people turn away. They told stories of ancient storms, of kingdoms swallowed when rulers mocked the rings. But fear is a fragile root. It cannot hold a tree forever. More and more, people began to believe that the rings belonged to no temple, no altar, no hierarchy. They belonged to the world itself. And in quiet corners away from the grand sanctuaries, new traditions began. Small circles drawn in dirt replaced great golden halls. Families gathered not under vaulted ceilings, but beneath the open sky, whispering gratitude when a ring appeared. The rings had always been simple, silent, glowing, eternal, and now people began to mirror that simplicity. The priests resisted, of course. In some lands, they tried to forbid such practices, declaring them heresy. But the rings themselves betrayed them. For time and again, the golden circles appeared where temples had no reach, on lonely roads, in forgotten fields, in forests where no altar stood. To the common people, this was proof enough. The rings did not belong to stone walls. They belonged to life itself. Stories from this time speak of wanderers who carried no wealth, no power, but walked with rings appearing often in their path. They were said to be humble souls, farmers, healers, children. Some claim the rings themselves sought such hearts, choosing to reveal their glow not to kings or priests, but to those who carried kindness quietly in their steps. One tale tells of a young girl who lived in a mountain village. Her people were starving after a long winter, and the temple demanded what little grain they had left for offering. Instead, she took the last handful of seed and scattered it upon the frozen soil, praying not to the temple, but to the land itself. Days later, when the ice thawed, villagers found golden rings hovering above the sprouting shoots. The harvest that year was abundant, and the temple's grip weakened forever. Such tales became more common as the age of temples waned. It was not rebellion that ended the era, but a return to simplicity. The people no longer needed stone monuments to remind them of the rings. They had the sky, the earth, the rivers, and the endless golden circles that appeared wherever life moved forward. Still, the temples did not vanish entirely. Some crumbled into ruins, their great spires swallowed by vines. Others remained standing, silent and empty. Their altars cold, but their walls still etched with circles. These ruins became places of quiet pilgrimage. travelers would sit among the broken stones, tracing faded carvings with their fingers, feeling the weight of centuries. In the silence, they listened not to priests, but to the hum of the world, the same hum that once guided their ancestors. And in that silence, rings continued to appear, faint, glowing, gentle. Proof that even when the voices of men fade, the circle endures. The age of temples, then, was not merely an era of faith, but an era of learning. Humanity had built upward, reaching for the sky, believing the higher the stone, the closer they came to eternity. But the rings taught a different lesson. They appeared just as often in the smallest corners as they did in the grandest halls. A child could stumble upon one in a meadow, and it would carry the same brilliance as those that glowed within golden shrines. This was the quiet revelation that closed the age. The rings did not belong to temples. The rings belonged to life itself. The final chapters of this age were marked not by collapse, but by transformation. Communities kept their rituals, but they grew gentler, more personal. No longer bound by towering walls, faith became something shared at firesides, in songs, in whispered prayers at dawn. The rings had returned to the people. And yet, though temples faded, their shadow lingered. The ruins remained scattered across the land, reminders of a time when humanity reached too high, too fast, hoping to hold eternity in their hands. Children grew up playing among broken arches, watching golden circles appear where priests once chanted. They learned to see the ruins not as failures, but as echoes, footprints of a journey their ancestors had taken in search of meaning. In this way, the age of temples never truly ended. It folded into the soil, into memory, into the quiet spaces between generations. Its stones became part of the landscape, and its lessons became part of the soul. For the rings themselves had not changed. They remained as they always were, shining, fleeting, eternal. But humanity had changed. They had learned that eternity could not be trapped in walls or held by crowns. It could only be touched briefly, like a spark in the dark, guiding them forward. And so the age of temples closed, not with a fall, but with a breath, a slow exhale, as the world moved gently into its next cycle. Chapter 3. The Chaos Connection. For ages, the rings had been a mystery wrapped in silence. They appeared when needed, glowed with their eternal light, and vanished again without explanation. Temples rose and fell. Stories were told and forgotten, but the rings themselves endured. Yet as the world moved forward, a new understanding began to form, one that connected the rings not only to faith or survival, but to the deeper, unseen forces that flowed through the earth itself. This new idea was born from the study of chaos energy. Long before the word chaos carried its modern weight of destruction and disorder, it was simply a name for the living current beneath all things. It was the breath of the earth, the pulse of the stars, the invisible river that moved through stone, wind, water, and life. Some called it spirit, others called it fire. But eventually the world agreed. It was chaos. And in time, observers noticed that where rings appeared, traces of chaos energy were always near. At first, this connection was faint, almost easy to dismiss. A ring glimmered above a stream where the water flowed strangely warm, humming with unseen power. Another appeared in a forest clearing where the air shimmered, as if charged by lightning that had never struck. Rings scattered along mountain ridges that shook with distant tremors, their glow brighter when the earth's heart rumbled below. Over generations, these patterns could no longer be ignored. The rings were not random. They bloomed where chaos energy was. For ages, the rings had been a mystery wrapped in silence. They appeared when needed, glowed with their eternal light, and vanished again without explanation. Temples rose and fell. Stories were told and forgotten, but the rings themselves endured. Yet as the world moved forward, a new understanding began to form, one that connected the rings not only to faith or survival, but to the deeper, unseen forces that flowed through the earth itself. This new idea was born from the study of chaos energy. Long before the word chaos carried its modern weight of destruction and disorder, it was simply a name for the living current beneath all things. It was the breath of the earth, the pulse of the stars, the invisible river that moved through stone, wind, water, and life. Some called it spirit, others called it fire. But eventually the world agreed. It was chaos. And in time, observers noticed that where rings appeared, traces of chaos energy were always near. At first, this connection was faint, almost easy to dismiss. A ring glimmered above a stream where the water flowed strangely warm, humming with unseen power. Another appeared in a forest clearing where the air shimmered, as if charged by lightning that had never struck. Rings scattered along mountain ridges that shook with distant tremors, their glow brighter when the earth's heart rumbled below. Over generations, these patterns could no longer be ignored. The rings were not random. They bloomed where chaos energy was strongest, as though drawn to it, or perhaps born from it. This realization changed everything. Suddenly, the rings were no longer only symbols of survival or eternity. They were clues, living fragments of a deeper force that shaped the world. To understand the rings was to understand chaos itself. Scholars and seekers began to map the land, tracing the flow of chaos energy like cartographers of an unseen river. They noted where rings appeared often, marking these places as wells of power. Some of these wells would later become sites of great significance, hidden grottos glowing faintly at night, valleys where the ground thrummed softly beneath bare feet, caves lined with crystals that pulsed faintly like beating hearts. The most daring explorers went further. They sought to hold rings for longer than a fleeting moment, to carry them close and study their glow. In doing so, they discovered something extraordinary. Rings seemed to resonate with the body itself. When held near the chest, the ring's hum aligned with the rhythm of the heart. When pressed to the palm, it pulsed like blood moving through veins. It was as though the rings recognized life, not as something separate from chaos, but as part of it. This revelation spread quickly. To many, it was proof that the rings were not just tools of protection. They were fragments of chaos energy itself, shaped into golden form for the living to touch. Each ring was a bridge, a momentary link between fragile flesh and the eternal current of the world. Naturally, such knowledge brought both wonder and danger. On one side, poets and mystics spoke of rings as blessings, gifts of the earth's living soul. They described them as echoes of chaos, soft enough to guide but never to overwhelm. They wrote songs about how each ring was a promise, that even in the darkest times, the world itself offered light to those who kept moving forward. But others saw opportunity. If rings were fragments of chaos, then perhaps they could be gathered, stored, and harnessed. Perhaps one could hold the flow of the earth itself in their hands. Entire generations of scholars devoted themselves to this pursuit, trying to trap rings inside crystal vessels or draw chaos energy into artificial shapes. Most failed. Rings resisted capture, scattering the moment greed pressed too close. But every failure only deepened the hunger to understand them. It was in this restless age that the idea of chaos emeralds began to surface. These were not mere fragments of golden light. but concentrated cores of chaos itself, said to hold power beyond comprehension. If rings were the sparks, then the emeralds were the fire. Legends suggest that the first whispers of the emeralds came from those who spent lifetimes studying rings, noticing the faint trails they left behind. They imagined that somewhere in the world the chaos current pooled more deeply, shaping not into fleeting circles but into lasting, solid jewels. Whether these tales were true or myth, no one could say. But the connection was clear. Rings and emeralds were bound by the same current, two forms of the same eternal energy. And with this connection came a shift in how the world saw the golden circles. No longer were they simply protective. No longer were they merely symbols. They were part of something vast, something ancient, something alive. Each ring that appeared was a glimpse into the great heartbeat of chaos, a reminder that the world itself was awake, always moving, always watching. Yet even as people sought to understand this connection, a question lingered in the shadows. If rings carried the gentlest echoes of chaos, what of its darker tides? For just as rivers can nourish, they can also flood. Just as fire can warm, it can consume. Chaos energy was no different, and the rings, those golden fragments of eternity, might not always appear only as guardians. They might also serve as warnings of storms to come. As the connection between rings and chaos energy became more widely understood, civilizations entered a new stage of obsession. Temples had once claimed the rings as divine symbols, but now kingdoms and empires saw them as fuel, literal fragments of power that might be bent to their will. At first, the efforts were small, experimental. Scholars tried to collect rings in sealed chambers, believing they could accumulate and concentrate the energy inside. But no matter how carefully they were gathered, the rings slipped away, fading like mist the moment containment was attempted. This was the first lesson. Rings resisted captivity. Yet this failure only deepened the hunger to master them. If rings could not be held by simple hands, then perhaps they could be channeled through tools. And so began the crafting of the first ring engines, primitive devices built from crystals, gears, and metals that sought to amplify the hum of chaos energy. When powered by rings, the machines would roar to life, moving with a strength far beyond ordinary human effort. For a time, these machines seemed miraculous. Farmers used them to plow entire fields in a fraction of the time. Miners dug deeper into mountains than ever before, guided by the glow of spinning rings that powered their drills. In the great cities, lights glimmered through the night, powered by endless circles of energy. To the common people, it felt as though the world itself had been reborn, bathed in golden light. But behind this light, a shadow stirred. The rings had always appeared to protect, to guide, to preserve life. They were fleeting by nature, scattering when hoarded, resisting those who sought to trap them. By twisting them into engines and forcing their energy into unnatural patterns, civilizations unknowingly disrupted the balance they were meant to uphold. Strange events began to occur. Farmers noticed that crops grown in fields plowed with ring engines withered more quickly, their roots weak and brittle. Miners who worked deep with ring-powered drills reported tremors shaking the stone, as if the earth itself was protesting. In the cities, people spoke of nights when the glow of their golden lights turned pale and cold, flickering with shadows instead of warmth. Some dismissed these as superstition, the fears of simple folk unready to embrace progress. But others, those who remembered the old teachings, recognized the truth. Rings were never meant to be tools of domination. They were fragments of chaos, and chaos did not suffer being chained. It was in this time that stories of ring storms first appeared. Witnesses described them as sudden bursts of energy, unleashed when rings were forced beyond their natural purpose. Golden light would swirl violently, circling like a hurricane of sparks. Machines would shatter, walls would collapse, and those caught within the storm would be flung aside by invisible force. And when the light cleared, no rings remained. The storm had devoured them, scattering their energy back into the world. To those who had grown dependent on ring technology, these storms were disasters. Crops failed, cities went dark, mines collapsed. But to those who listened closely, there were something more. Warnings. Reminders that rings were not gifts to be consumed endlessly. They were guardians, and when pushed too far, they defended themselves. Despite the dangers, ambition rarely sleeps. Some rulers saw the storms not as warnings, but as challenges. If rings could unleash such violent energy when provoked, then surely they could be weaponized. Armies began to experiment with ring-powered weapons, blades that hummed with light, cannons that fired bursts of golden fire, armor infused with protective rings. The results were catastrophic. Weapons burned out within minutes, their energy scattering before a battle even began. Cannons misfired, exploding in golden storms that destroyed friend and foe alike. Entire battalions vanished in flashes of light, erased by the very power they sought to wield. Wars fought with rings ended not in victory, but in silence, as both sides were left broken by forces they could not contain. From these failures, a grim respect began to grow. Slowly, rulers and scholars alike realized what temples and storytellers had known all along. Rings were not meant for conquest. They did not bend to greed, nor did they reward pride. They existed only to protect life, to soften harm, to guide those who moved forward. And yet, even as this truth returned to the surface, a darker question continued to linger. If rings were the gentle echoes of chaos energy, then what of its more violent forms? What if the storms were not merely accidents, but glimpses of something deeper, more dangerous, lying beneath the surface of the world? In quiet circles, whispers spread of a force older and more volatile than the rings. Where the rings shielded life, this energy consumed it. Where the rings appeared to protect, this energy appeared to destroy. It was chaos, but in its rawest, untamed state. And though the people feared it, they could not ignore the truth. The rings were not separate from this darkness. They were connected, born from the same current. The golden circles that floated so gently above the earth were not only gifts, they were also warnings. For to follow the path of the rings was to step closer and closer to the heart of chaos itself. The discovery that rings were bound to chaos energy was not the end of the mystery, but the beginning of a deeper one. For if rings were born from chaos, then humanity stood forever balanced between two truths: the light that guided and the darkness that consumed. Generations of storytellers wove this paradox into myths. They said that the rings were the laughter of chaos, its gentle hum, its promise that even in disorder there could be harmony. But they also whispered of the storms, the shadows, the moments when chaos revealed its fury. In these darker tales, rings were not only protectors, they were warnings, the golden leaves that fell before the coming fire. One story tells of a wandering monk who sought to trace the flow of chaos to its source. For years he followed the trail of rings, walking across mountains, deserts, and seas, always chasing the golden glow. At last, he reached a hidden cavern where the air pulsed so strongly it nearly drove him to his knees. In the center of the cave, rings appeared endlessly, one after another. scattering into the air like sparks from an eternal flame. The monk fell to the ground and wept, not from fear, but from awe, for he realized he had reached the very heart of chaos, a place where energy was so alive that it shaped itself into endless circles of light. But he did not linger. He left the cavern and never revealed its location, warning that no mortal should dare to hold so close to the current of eternity. Another tale speaks of a warlord who ignored such warnings. Obsessed with harnessing chaos, he sent armies to gather rings, building vast machines designed to bend them into weapons. At first, he triumphed. His forces grew powerful, cutting down rivals with ease. But the rings he hoarded began to turn restless. They scattered from his machines, bursting into storms that swallowed his armies whole. In the final battle, a great whirl of light consumed his fortress, erasing it from the earth. When the smoke cleared, nothing remained but silence, and a single ring, floating gently in the ruins, as if to remind the world that greed always breaks upon the circle. These stories carried through the centuries, shaping not only fear, but wisdom. Rings were no longer seen merely as fragments of power, but as teachers. They reminded humanity of balance, that chaos was not only creation, and not only destruction, but both. To live with rings was to live with that balance, to walk carefully upon a world that could be both gentle and unforgiving. It was in this time of reflection that the idea of the guardians emerged. Some believed that certain people were chosen not only to use rings, but to protect their deeper truths. These guardians were not kings or priests, but wanderers, those who lived simply, who walked with humility, who did not seek power. It was said that rings appeared more often in their presence, guiding them, strengthening them, shielding them from harm. To others, this was no accident. The rings themselves chose their guardians, seeking out hearts steady enough to bear their burden. From these beliefs grew new traditions. Villages told their children that kindness would draw the rings closer, that cruelty would drive them away. Travelers were taught to walk lightly, to never hoard rings, to return them to the earth when their journey was done. These were not laws written in stone, but wisdom carried in whispers. Gentle reminders that to walk with rings was to walk with chaos, and to walk with chaos was to walk with care. And yet, even in wisdom, curiosity endured. Scholars continued to search for the deeper connection between rings and the great chaos emeralds, whose legends grew louder with each passing age. If the emeralds truly were the concentrated hearts of chaos, then rings were their echoes, scattering across the world like sparks from a fire. Some believed that gathering enough rings at once could awaken an emerald, stirring its hidden light. Others argued the opposite, that emeralds birthed the rings themselves, releasing fragments of energy into the world like a tree scattering seeds. The truth remained elusive, hidden behind the same veil that had always cloaked the rings. But what mattered was not the answer, but the journey. For every attempt to understand chaos led humanity to the same conclusion. Balance was everything. Greed led to storms. Humility led to guidance. Destruction and creation walked side by side, each born from the same current, each reflected in the golden circle. The chaos connection, as it came to be known, marked a turning point in the slow history of rings. No longer were they seen as isolated mysteries. They were threads woven into the very fabric of the world, inseparable from the forces that shaped earth, sky, and soul. To touch a ring was to touch chaos itself, softly, briefly, safely. To misuse it was to risk awakening its fury. This duality shaped heroes as much as it shaped empires. Those who walked with rings found not only strength but responsibility. To wield the golden light was to be reminded always of the balance it represented. Heroes who forgot this balance, who grew arrogant or reckless, were humbled swiftly, their rings scattering into storms. But those who remembered the lessons of humility, of moving forward step by step, found that the rings did not abandon them. They lingered close, shimmering just out of reach, ready to shield and guide in moments of need. Perhaps that is the truest meaning of the chaos connection. Rings were never meant to be owned, hoarded, or commanded. They were companions. They walked alongside life, rising when needed, vanishing when the lesson was learned. They were not answers to questions, but reminders that some questions should never be answered at all. And so the chapter of chaos closed with the same quiet paradox it had begun with. The rings are fleeting yet eternal, gentle yet dangerous. Born of chaos yet carrying peace. They are circles of light drawn across the dark. Fragments of a force too vast to hold, too deep to name, yet close enough to touch, if only for a moment. To walk with rings is to walk with chaos. To walk with chaos is to walk with balance. And balance, as the rings have always shown, is the secret heartbeat of the world. As the ages passed and the truth of the chaos connection seeped into every story and legend, a new pattern began to emerge. The rings did not only appear in places of faith, or at the edges of storms, or beside the hidden veins of the earth. More and more they seemed to follow people, certain people, chosen or cursed, depending on who told the tale. These were the ones who would become heroes. The world was never still. Kingdoms rose and fell. Storms tore across the land, and the balance of chaos shifted like the tide. In times of hardship, when darkness stretched too far and survival seemed impossible, there were always those who stepped forward, and wherever they walked, the rings followed. At first, this pattern was dismissed as coincidence. Rings appeared everywhere, after all. Why should they not appear near a wandering traveler or a desperate fighter? But the story is repeated too often to be ignored. A soldier mortally wounded on the battlefield, suddenly saved as rings scattered across the ground around him. A child lost in a storm, finding her path lit by golden circles until she returned to her village. A wanderer cornered by beasts, his body glowing faintly as rings absorbed each blow. The people began to believe that rings did not simply protect life in general. They protected those who carried the weight of trials, those who stood at the edge of despair and refused to fall. In this way, the rings became not just symbols of eternity or balance, but of courage itself. And so began the Age of Trials. Every culture shaped its own version of these heroic tests. In the mountain villages, young men and women were sent alone into the wilderness, armed with nothing but their will. If rings appeared in their path, it was taken as a sign that chaos itself walked with them, marking them for greatness. In coastal cities, sailors would brave storms without sails, trusting the rings to shield them from the sea's fury. Survivors were said to be touched by the circle, destined to become leaders or champions. Some of these trials were ritualized, passed down carefully from one generation to the next. Others came naturally, born of war, famine, or disaster. But in all of them, the rings played the same role. They appeared when courage met hardship, when fear pressed down, and still the heart pressed forward. It was during this time that rings began to be spoken of, not as passive gifts, but as companions. The phrase, "the circle walks beside you," entered language across the world, used to comfort the struggling or inspire the weary. Parents whispered it to children. Warriors carved it into their shields. Healers spoke it to the sick. It was a promise that even when strength seemed to fail, the rings would not abandon those who kept moving forward. But as with all gifts, there was a shadow. If rings could follow heroes, they could also expose them. A warrior walking into a village with circles of gold shimmering at their feet was met with awe, but also with fear. For the rings were proof that trials walked close behind. The chaos itself lingered in their shadow. Some believed that those chosen by rings were cursed, magnets for storms and battles. Villages sometimes turned them away, afraid of the burden that followed. This tension created a paradox for heroes. To walk with rings was both a blessing and a weight. It meant that they would not fall easily, that they could endure what others could not. But it also meant they were never free from danger. Trials clung to them as tightly as the golden circles. Legends from this time are filled with such figures. The wanderer who could not fall, who fought for 100 nights without rest, rings scattering around him each time he was struck. The silent child who never spoke a word, but guided lost travelers through forests, the path lit by circles of light. The broken knight, who carried wounds too deep for ordinary flesh, yet whose body was bound together by the endless glow of rings. These stories were not about victory alone. They were about endurance, about the quiet courage of surviving trials that should have ended them. Heroes were not those who never fell, but those who always rose again, carried forward by the rings that refused to let their spark go dark. And yet, beneath the awe and reverence, an unspoken question haunted the age. Were these heroes chosen by the rings or trapped by them? Did the golden circles appear because they were brave, or because chaos demanded their suffering to keep balance intact? The answer never came. But perhaps it did not need to. For the rings did what they had always done. They appeared in silence, offering no explanation, only light. And those who walked with them, whether chosen or cursed, had no choice but to continue forward. The age of trials stretched across centuries, weaving itself into every land touched by chaos. From desert kingdoms to frozen peaks, the rings followed wherever courage was tested. And as their presence deepened in the world, people began to shape their societies around them, folding the mystery of rings into law, culture, and destiny. In one distant desert where the sands shifted endlessly and swallowed cities whole, an ancient kingdom carved its trials directly into stone. There, a young ruler was not crowned by inheritance, but by endurance. On the eve of their ascension, they were sent into the desert without water, without guard, without wealth. They were told, "If the rings follow, then chaos blesses your reign. If they do not, then the sand will take you." Survivors always returned surrounded by a faint shimmer of gold. Some came back broken, scorched by the desert sun, their skin cracked and eyes hollow, yet carried forward by the unrelenting circles that refused to let them fall. Others came back stronger, their steps marked with glowing trails of protection, their spirits hardened by the trial. To the people, these were signs that their leader was chosen not by blood, but by balance itself. Far away in the frozen mountains, the story unfolded differently. There, communities lived in constant struggle against avalanches and howling blizzards. Their trials were born not from ritual, but from survival itself. Hunters chasing prey across the ice would sometimes stumble, their bodies striking jagged cliffs, only for rings to scatter from them, cushioning the blow. Climbers dangling from brittle ropes would fall, only to find themselves wrapped in golden energy, lowered gently to the ground. Over time, these moments grew into legend. Entire villages believed that heroes were not created in training halls or temples, but in the storm itself. The rings chose their champions when no one else was watching, when life teetered on the edge of silence. In coastal towns, the sea itself became the stage of the trials. Sailors would speak of journeys where storms rose without warning, waves taller than cliffs crashing onto the ships. At the brink of ruin, the deck would suddenly sparkle with golden circles. Men and women who were thrown overboard would resurface surrounded by rings, their bodies still glowing as they swam to shore. Tales spread of captains who guided their ships across impossible waters, their path marked by a glimmering chain of rings floating above the waves, as though chaos itself had drawn them a road of light. Each culture had its own stories, its own way of interpreting the trials. But across all lands, one truth echoed. Rings revealed themselves most clearly when the heart was tested. Not in moments of ease or luxury, but in moments of peril when the world pressed down with unbearable weight. Heroes of this age were remembered not for their victories alone, but for the depth of their endurance. In some stories, the hero triumphed over enemies with strength magnified by the rings. In others, they simply survived when no one else could. They endured storms that should have drowned them, fought wounds that should have claimed them, and rose again from battles that should have ended them. But this endurance carried its own cost. Many who bore the rings for too long spoke of exhaustion unlike anything ordinary. Some whispered that the rings drained as much as they gave, binding the hero to an endless cycle of trial after trial. For every blow softened, another waited. For every fall cushioned, another cliff rose. The rings did not end the trial, they extended it, pushing the hero to rise again and again, beyond the point where others would have found rest. This dual nature gave rise to darker tales. There were songs of wanderers who never aged, always seen walking across battlefields, rings scattering at their feet with every strike. Some called them immortals, blessed beyond measure. Others called them cursed, bound forever to suffering, never allowed to escape the endless rhythm of trial and recovery. One story tells of a nameless knight who bore rings for a lifetime. Each time he fell, he rose. Each time he bled, his wounds closed under golden light. His enemies came and went, generations passing, yet still the knight walked, his armor rusting, his face forgotten. The tale ends not with his triumph, but with his silence, vanishing into a forest, never seen again. Some say he was finally freed when his rings scattered for the last time. Others say he still walks, glowing faintly beneath the moon, waiting for another trial to summon him forward. Such stories blurred the line between inspiration and warning. The rings were saviors, but they were also chains. Heroes who carried them lived longer, fought harder, endured deeper than any ordinary soul. But in doing so, they lost something. Perhaps peace, perhaps rest, perhaps the freedom to ever truly lay down their burdens. Still, despite the doubts, the people revered them. When danger rose, they looked not to kings or priests, but to the ones who walked with rings. The wanderers, the warriors, the sailors, the children who glowed with gold when trials came. They were seen as the eternal guardians of balance, born from chaos, yet carrying light into the darkest storms. And so, in every culture, heroes became living symbols of the rings themselves, fragile yet enduring, fleeting yet eternal. They fell, but they rose. They shattered, but they reformed. They carried the cycle forward just as the rings had always done. The age of trials was not one of peace, but it was one of resilience. And in its echoes, the legend of the rings deepened, stretching beyond simple survival into something far greater. The rings were no longer just scattered fragments of chaos. They were companions of heroes, forever tied to the courage that kept the world alive. As the stories of wanderers and nameless knights faded into the mists of time, the world moved forward. Civilizations rose, technology advanced, and the old shrines of stone and desert trials became little more than ruins. Yet the rings never vanished. They shimmered still, scattered across every land, appearing in the very moments when courage was needed most. The heroes of the old age had passed into legend, but the trials of heroes continued. And in time, new figures stepped forward, figures whose names echo even now. Among them was Sonic, the hedgehog who ran not only with speed, but with an endless will to rise against the impossible. Wherever he went, the rings followed. To outsiders, it seemed like coincidence, a simple quirk of his journeys. But those who looked closer saw the same ancient rhythm, the same cycle that had carried heroes for millennia. Every battle Sonic faced mirrored the age-old truth of the trials, that the rings were not simply possessions, but companions in struggle. When danger struck him, rings scattered, and yet he endured. When defeat loomed, the golden glow pulled him back, urging him to continue forward. Just like the wanderers of old, Sonic's story was not one of never falling, but of always rising again. It was as though the rings themselves had chosen him, recognizing his restless spirit, his refusal to give in to despair. And in him, the people of his world saw not only a protector, but a continuation of something far older than they understood. The eternal partnership between rings and courage. Yet Sonic was not alone. The trials of heroes have always chosen many, and the rings have always walked with more than one figure. Tails, the young fox who followed Sonic, bore a different kind of trial. His was not the trial of speed or battle, but of heart, of standing in the shadow of greatness, of daring to believe that he could walk alongside a hero. In his hands, the rings became tokens of belief. Each one he gathered was a quiet whisper that he belonged, that the courage within him was just as real, even if it shone more softly. Knuckles, the guardian of the Master Emerald, faced trials of solitude. The rings that appeared in his path were not scattered across battlefields, but hidden deep within ancient places. His courage was not only in fighting, but in waiting, in guarding, in carrying a duty that stretched back to ages when temples still stood. For him, the rings were reminders that even in silence and lonely trials, the cycle of endurance continued. Shadow's trials were darker still. For him, the rings often appeared in moments of torment, when his past pressed heavily against his spirit. They followed him not to celebrate his courage, but to test it. Every ring he gathered seemed to ask him the same question. Would he endure, or would he fall into the shadows that sought to claim him? In this way, his story became one of balance, of fighting not only external foes, but the storms within. Even Dr. Eggman, though an enemy, played his part in the eternal dance of rings and trials. In his relentless pursuit of control, he too faced challenges that tested his will. Rings scattered in his path as well, though he often sought to twist their meaning, seeing them as fuel or resource rather than companions. Yet even in his misuse, he could not escape the truth. The rings always resisted ownership. They were never truly his, no matter how many machines he built to capture them. What unites all these figures, Sonic, Tails, Knuckles, Shadow, even Eggman, is that the rings followed them because they walked into trials. Their journeys were not free of hardship, not free of failure, but they were paths of endurance. And the rings, as they always had, appeared in those moments of danger and choice, weaving themselves into the heart of every hero's story. The people of the present may not remember the desert kings, the mountain hunters, or the nameless knights. They may not speak of the silent child or the broken wanderer. But in watching Sonic and his companions, and seeing the rings scatter and reform around them, they glimpse the same timeless pattern. The rings have always been there, companions of courage, guardians of balance. And so the cycle continues. The paradox remains too. The rings bless, but they also burden. They give endurance, but they demand resilience. Sonic, in his boundless energy, may not feel the weight as heavily as those before him, but even he cannot escape the rhythm. Each time the rings scatter from his body, each time they shimmer away into nothingness, the trial continues. The cycle is unbroken. Perhaps that is why the sight of rings glimmering across a field or hovering in the air stirs such quiet wonder. They are not treasure, though they sparkle like gold. They are not weapons, though they shield against death. They are the memory of every hero who has walked before, the echo of every trial endured, the promise of every trial yet to come. The old sayings linger even now. The circle walks beside you. The rings follow the brave. They scatter, but they return. These words, once carved into shields and whispered to children, still carry meaning, even in a world far removed from temples and rituals. Because in truth, every life carries trials, every soul faces storms. And the rings remind us that endurance is possible, that even in the face of ruin, the spark within can rise again. Heroes may stumble, they may fall, but they are never abandoned. And so the trials of heroes stretch onward from the ancient wanderers to Sonic, from the deserts of forgotten kings to the forests and cities of today. The golden circles scatter, fade, and return. They wait always for the next heart to step forward, for the next soul to bear the weight of the trial. It is a cycle without end. Somewhere in the quiet corners of the world, a child stumbles and finds a ring glowing softly in the grass. Somewhere else, a warrior falls and rises again, golden lights scattering around their broken body. Somewhere still, Sonic runs, the rings chiming in his wake, each one a note in a song as old as chaos itself. The rings endure. The trials endure. And the heroes, no matter how fleeting their names, carry forward the same eternal truth. To fall is not the end, for the rings are there to remind us that courage, once kindled, can never truly be extinguished. Chapter 5. The Lost Interpretations. For every story that honored the rings as companions of courage, there were others that told of their misuse. If the age of temples was a time of reverence, and the trials of heroes a time of endurance, then this chapter of history is remembered as something far more troubled. It was the age when people began to believe that the rings could be owned. The mistake seemed small at first, innocent even. After all, who would not want to gather the shimmering circles that appeared so freely across the land? Children chased them in fields, collecting them as prizes. Farmers lined them along their walls as tokens of luck. Traders bartered with them, believing that the glow of a ring carried more promise than any coin. And in their simplicity, perhaps they were not wrong. For the rings always returned, never truly consumed, always vanishing and reappearing somewhere else. But the misinterpretation grew. The further people strayed from the old shrines, the more they forgot the truth. They stopped seeing rings as companions, as guardians who appeared in trials, and instead began to see them as treasure. They were gold, and gold meant power. And power, when hoarded, could reshape the fate of kingdoms. Across the world, rulers ordered their people to gather rings by the thousands. Great vaults were filled with shimmering light, mountains of circles stacked upon one another, until their glow lit the night like fire. These rulers declared themselves chosen by chaos, their hordes proof that they were favored above all others. But the rings did not obey ownership. They slipped through the cracks of vault doors, vanished from piles as if they had never been there. Kingdoms that had filled entire treasuries found them empty by morning. The glow dissolved into nothing. Some rulers went mad, accusing their subjects of theft, punishing entire villages for what the rings themselves had undone. Still, they did not learn. They believed the fault lay not in the rings, but in themselves, that they had not hoarded enough, not guarded tightly enough, not seized enough of the golden flow. So they built armies to chase them. Men and women marched across fields, through forests, and into mountains, sweeping rings into nets and sacks, dragging them back to their cities. But no matter how many they gathered, no matter how tightly they locked them away, the rings always slipped away again. It was during this era that the darkest myths of the rings were born. Tales speak of kingdoms that collapsed into famine and ruin, their leaders so consumed by the hunger for rings that they forgot to feed their people. Others tell of kings and queens who believed that if they carried enough rings, they could never die, that the golden glow would protect them forever. These rulers threw themselves into battle again and again. Their bodies restored each time they fell, but only for a while. For the rings never promised eternity, they promised endurance. And when the final spark left them, their hordes vanished along with their lives, scattering across the land once more. Some stories go further still, whispering of rings that refused to scatter, rings that clung to the hands of those who sought to own them. These cursed circles, it is said, burned with a glow that never faded, binding themselves to their bearers until the flesh blackened beneath them. Such myths tell of rulers driven mad, their eyes glowing gold as they wandered their empty halls, haunted by the endless energy they had tried to claim. Whether true or not, the fear of cursed rings spread. In some lands, people refused to touch them at all, leaving fields of golden circles untouched, shimmering in silence. In others, rings were still gathered, but only under ritual, washed in sacred water, cleansed with chants, treated not as treasure, but as fire that could burn if misused. But for every culture that approached the rings with caution, another twisted their meaning further. In one war-torn land, generals discovered that rings could keep their soldiers alive longer in battle. Warriors carried them strapped to their belts, charging into combat with reckless fury. When struck, their rings scattered, and they rose again, rushing back into the fight. This created armies of men and women who seemed unkillable, glowing gold even as blood ran down their armor. But such endurance came with cost. The soldiers did not rest. They did not retreat. They fought until their bodies collapsed beyond saving, and when they finally fell, the rings scattered away, leaving only silence. Those who watched these battles came to fear the glow of rings, associating them not with courage, but with endless, merciless war. The myth of the unbroken army was born in this time. Some say that even now their spirits march still, phantoms of soldiers whose rings never scattered, bound eternally to battlefields long forgotten. In the quietest nights, travelers claim to hear the clatter of armor, the faint chime of rings, and the sound of footsteps that never end. It is strange to think how quickly the meaning of rings could shift. Where once they were symbols of courage, now they were twisted into signs of greed, power, and endless conflict. The people no longer said, "The circle walks beside you." Instead, they whispered warnings. Beware the one who carries too many. Yet even in this age of misinterpretation, the rings themselves never changed. They appeared in storms, in trials, in moments of peril, just as they always had. They scattered when danger struck. They returned when balance called them back. It was not the rings that had shifted. It was the hearts of those who looked upon them. And in that, perhaps, lies the deepest lesson of this age. That the rings reflect not only the balance of chaos, but the balance within those who gather them. To the brave, they are companions. To the desperate, they are lifelines. To the greedy, they are chains. To the foolish, they are curses. The rings themselves remain silent, offering no explanation. They scatter, they return, they endure. But in the hands of mortals, their silence became filled with endless interpretations, some noble, some dark, some utterly broken. And so the lost interpretations took root. A world that once saw rings as guardians of courage now fractured into countless beliefs, each shaping the circles to fit their own desires. In doing so, they lost sight of what the rings had always been: fleeting, fragile, eternal companions of the trial. But the rings endure, and they wait always for the next story and the next bearer, the next interpretation, whether noble or cursed. The deeper we look into this troubled era, the more tangled the myths become. Unlike the calm stories of temples or the noble tales of heroes, the lost interpretations feel restless, almost fevered. They are not sung in peaceful tones around firesides, but whispered in fear, as though speaking too loudly might call the curses back into the world. And perhaps it is not surprising, for when people tried to own what could never be owned, the balance of the rings slipped further from their grasp. The Kingdom of Endless Vaults. There is a tale of a kingdom known only as the Land of Endless Vaults. It is said that this kingdom built its entire identity around rings. Miners were sent deep into mountains to gather them, even though the rings were not born of stone. Divers plunged into oceans, searching for shimmering circles among coral, though the rings were not treasures of the sea. When people returned empty-handed, they were punished. The king of this land declared that one day he would gather so many rings that he could buy eternity itself. He filled vault after vault, towers of glowing circles stacked upon one another like golden suns. Yet, as always, the rings slipped away in the night. The people despaired. The king raged. He ordered larger vault, stronger doors, deeper chambers. But still the rings vanished. In time, the kingdom starved. The farmers were too busy hunting for rings to grow crops. The merchants abandoned trade for the chase of golden circles. The soldiers guarded empty vaults, their hands trembling, their bellies hollow. One night the king entered his grandest vault to see it shining brighter than the sun itself. He believed at last that he had succeeded. But the light grew stronger and stronger until it consumed him. When morning came, the vault was empty and the kingdom lay in ruins. Some say the light itself burned the land away, leaving only ashes where a city once stood. Even now, wanderers claim to see faint golden circles floating above those ashes on moonlit nights, rings that drift like fireflies, haunting the place where greed swallowed a people whole, the silent ruins. Another story tells of a place where rings were not gathered for wealth but for silence. In this land, the rulers believed that rings were voices of the gods, and that by keeping enough of them, they could force the world to speak. They built temples where rings were piled high upon altars, and priests prayed to the glowing stacks for answers. But the rings gave no reply. They shimmered, they scattered, they returned, but they never spoke. The silence drove the priests mad. They accused one another of angering the gods, of placing the rings wrongly, of failing to worship with enough devotion. One by one, the temples fell into chaos. Sacrifices were made to wake the rings. Wars broke out between factions who believed the silence was punishment. And slowly, the land emptied. Cities were left hollow, their streets glowing faintly with rings that hovered in the air, untouched. Travelers still tell of these ruins. They say you can walk through them for days and never hear a sound. Not even the wind stirs. Only the faint chiming of rings breaks the silence, echoing against the stone walls of temples where no voices remain. The cursed hordes. Perhaps the most unsettling myths of this age are those of cursed rings, circles that refused to scatter, that clung to their bearers with unyielding grip. One legend speaks of a warlord who sought to bind rings to his very flesh. He wore them as armor, forcing them into chains and gauntlets, believing they would make him invincible. At first they worked. Blades shattered against his body. Fire passed over him like wind. But the rings began to sink into his skin. Their glow burned from within, searing his veins with golden light. His soldiers watched as he grew more monstrous with each passing day, his body warped by the endless energy he had tried to enslave. In the end, he no longer spoke, no longer commanded. He wandered the battlefield as a husk of gold and shadow until he finally crumbled to dust. The rings, freed at last, scattered to the winds, leaving no trace of the warlord's kingdom behind. Another tale tells of a queen who wore a single ring upon her finger, one that never faded, never scattered, never left her hand. She believed it was a gift from the gods, proof that she was destined to rule forever. But over time, the ring grew heavier. Her hand withered. Her eyes glowed faint gold, and she stopped sleeping, stopped eating, consumed only by the endless weight of the circle she could not remove. Her kingdom collapsed around her, forgotten, but still the story remains. Some say that on certain nights you can see her wandering the ruins, her hand still glowing with the cursed ring, her eyes empty as she searches for release. Interpretations without end. These myths of cursed hordes and silent ruins tell us something profound. They show that the rings, which were meant as companions in trial, can reflect the darkest corners of the heart. To the greedy, they become a curse. To the desperate, they become chains. To the arrogant, they become ruin. And yet, the rings themselves never change. They scatter, they return, they endure. It is the people who misinterpret them. The fault lies not in the circles of gold, but in the endless hunger of those who see them as more than they are. The lost interpretations, then, are not only warnings of greed or madness, they are reminders of a deeper truth, that meaning is fragile. A symbol can carry courage one day and destruction the next. The rings do not choose their interpretation. The people do. Echoes in the present. Though these kingdoms are long gone, their echoes remain the stories of today. Even Sonic's world has felt the shadows of the lost interpretations. Dr. Eggman, in his relentless ambition, mirrors the rulers of vaults. He gathers rings for machines, not understanding that they slip away from control. His factories and prisons are not so different from the endless vaults of the fallen kings. Shadow, too, carries echoes of cursed rings. The trials he endures are not only of survival, but of meaning. Every ring he gathers is a question. Does he rise because of his own will, or because the rings demand it? His struggle with identity mirrors those who once saw rings as chains, binding them to fates they did not choose. Even Sonic, beloved for his courage, carries the shadow of the trials. Each time he scatters rings, each time he gathers them again, he steps into the same rhythm that broke kings, haunted queens, and cursed warlords. He does not fall into their ruin, but the echo is there, lingering in the chime of every circle. And perhaps that is why the rings continue to fascinate. They are not simply tools of survival, not simply scattered light. They are mirrors. They reflect the heart of whoever carries them, magnifying courage, greed, despair, or hope. Closing reflections. The lost interpretations remind us that not all stories are simple, and not all symbols are pure. The rings, eternal as they are, cannot protect against the corruption of meaning. But perhaps there is comfort in this as well, for just as greed can twist them, courage can restore them. Just as kingdoms fell into silence and ruin, heroes still rise, gathering rings not for ownership but for endurance. The rings remain patient, waiting for the heart that understands them. And so even after the age of vaults and curses, even after the ruins of silence, the rings continue their endless cycle. They scatter, they return, they endure. They do not belong to kings. They do not belong to vaults. They do not belong to greed. They belong only to the trial, to the moment when courage is tested, when balance trembles, when life itself leans toward shadow. And in that moment, as always, the rings appear, golden fireflies in the dark, silent companions of the brave, echoes of the eternal cycle. Chapter 6. The Eternal Cycle of Gold. The story of the rings has always been one of motion. They appear, they vanish, they scatter, they return. No vault can hold them. No hand can keep them forever. No empire, no hero, no villain has ever truly mastered them. And yet, despite this, the rings endure. They weave themselves into every era, every story, every myth, as though they were threads stitching the world together. This is why the final chapter of their tale is not about kings or temples or cursed vaults. It is about the cycle itself, the eternal rhythm of gold, the dance of vanishing and return. If you've ever watched Sonic dart across a field, you know the familiar sight. A gleaming trail of rings stretches ahead, glowing softly in the air. He leaps through them, and the trail scatters into nothing. For a moment, it feels as though the rings are gone forever, snatched away in the rush of speed. But they are not gone. Somewhere in some quiet fold of reality, they return. The next time Sonic passes, there they are again, waiting in the same places as though time itself has rewound just enough to set them back. This cycle has no beginning and no end. It is as natural as the tides, as certain as the sunrise. Rings vanish, rings return. And in that vanishing and returning, they remind us of something deeper. Nothing we hold on to is truly permanent, and yet nothing is ever truly lost. The people of old recognized this cycle, though they interpreted it differently in each age. Some saw it as divine patience, others as punishment. Some saw it as the immortality of energy, others as the futility of possession. But no matter the story, the rhythm remained. The rings scatter, the rings return, echoes of the first spark. When we go back to the very beginning, the first spark, the moment when the first rings shimmered into being, what do we find? We find not a treasure chest, not a crown, not a weapon. We find light, gentle, patient light, waiting to be noticed. The people who first stumbled upon the rings did not rush to collect them. They simply watched, awestruck, as golden circles floated in the air, humming softly like whispers of the cosmos. Those early witnesses didn't need myths or temples to explain the rings. They accepted them as they were, mysteries, companions, eternal flames that danced but did not die. It was only later that people tried to claim them, to trap them, to twist them into something more than they were. But before all that, in that earliest age, the rings were simply there, scattered like stars across the land, timeless and free. And in many ways, that is how they remain today. The heroes and the pattern. From Sonic to Tails, from Knuckles to Shadow, every hero who has ever touched the rings has stepped into this ancient rhythm. It is not a power they control. It is not a trick they master. It is simply there, wrapping itself around them in times of need. Think of Sonic in battle. He takes a hit. His rings scatter, a shower of gold flashing out into the air. The world seems to stop for a moment, because we know that if he does not gather at least one again, he will fall. And yet somehow he always does. The rings return to him, not because they favor him, but because that is their nature. It is as though the rings whisper, fall and rise again, scatter and gather again, lose and find again. The heroes of this world do not resist the cycle. They move with it. Sonic does not despair when rings scatter from his grip. He simply runs, knowing that the path will carry him to more. Knuckles does not hoard them, because his place is to guard something far greater, the Master Emerald itself. Tails, with his boundless curiosity, studies them, but never seeks to own them. Even Shadow, with all his conflict, cannot deny the cycle's hold on him. The rings are not loyal to a single hero. They are loyal only to the rhythm. Villains in the cycle. If the heroes flow with the rhythm, the villains resist it. Dr. Eggman gathers rings for machine, engines, weapons. He believes he can store them, siphon them, turn them into endless fuel. But his machines always fail. The rings scatter. The energy slips through his grasp. No amount of vaults or circuits can hold them. Other foes, like Chaos, the ancient guardian of the Chow, reveal another truth of the cycle. Chaos is not villainous in the same sense as Eggman, but he embodies the raw power of energy unrestrained. His connection to the Chaos Emerald shows the same pattern. Energy surges, energy scatters, energy returns. The rings hum to the same law, reminding us that even destruction cannot end the cycle. It only transforms it. Even the most terrifying enemies, beasts born of shadows, entities tied to destruction, cannot escape the rhythm of gold. They may scatter the rings from heroes' hands, but those same rings will return, waiting for courage to gather them again. Cycles in nature. The people of the lost interpretations were not wrong when they connected the rings to nature. They saw the scattering and return as echoes of rain and drought, of moon and tide, of life and death. Look closely, and you can see the truth in their vision. The rings scatter like seeds blown from a tree, drifting on the wind to settle somewhere else. They return like blossoms in spring, eternal in their patience. They vanish like the sun at dusk and glow again like dawn. Life itself is a cycle, breath drawn in, breath let out. A heart that beats, pauses, and beats again. The rings are not foreign to this world. They are part of it, a golden echo of the same truth. Nothing is permanent, and nothing is wasted. What is lost will return, though perhaps not in the same way. The eternal fireflies. Sometimes when the world is quiet, when night has fallen and the forests are still, you might imagine the rings as fireflies drifting through the dark. They hover, they shimmer, they vanish into the trees, only to glow again somewhere else. This is perhaps the gentlest way to think of the cycle. Not as a law, not as a burden, not as a test, but as a dance of light in the dark. And that is why Sonic's rings soothe us, even as they thrill us. Their chiming notes are lullabies. Their glow is calming, hypnotic. They tell us without words, you are safe. You will rise again. Nothing is ever truly gone. It is this quiet, patient rhythm that makes the rings eternal. Not in their substance, but in their meaning. Rings as a symbol of rebirth. To watch Sonic scatter his rings is to watch a death that never fully takes hold. The moment the golden trail bursts away from him, it feels final, a hero struck, his energy ripped into the air. Yet almost miraculously, it is not the end. Sonic leaps, dives, runs, and the rings return to him. That moment of recovery is not simply survival, it is rebirth. It is as though the rings themselves embody the eternal truth that life is not a straight line, but a circle. Fall, rise, scatter, gather, lose, find. The rings do not erase the strike Sonic has endured. They transform it into a chance to begin again. This is why the rings hold such a deep place in the lore of the world. They are not protection the way a shield is. They are not strength in the way a weapon is. They are resilience. They whisper the most comforting truth a fragile heart could hear. You can begin again. The ancients, too, saw this. In their carvings, you can find images of rings drawn not as treasures, but as halos, looping around the heads of guardians and wanderers alike. They understood that rings were not about wealth, but about continuity, about the way life bends, breaks, and then flows again into shape. Sonic's place in the cycle. When we think of Sonic himself, it's impossible not to see him as the living embodiment of this rhythm. He doesn't stop when he scatters his rings. He doesn't freeze when danger strips them away. He keeps moving. He trusts that the cycle will carry him forward. Perhaps this is why the rings seem so loyal to him. Not because he owns them, he doesn't, but because he honors them. He doesn't hoard, doesn't cage, doesn't cling. He lets them scatter. He lets them return. In many ways, Sonic is not just a hero who uses rings. He is a partner to their rhythm. His speed, his courage, his endless refusal to stop are reflections of the same eternal motion that guides the rings. Together, Sonic and the rings form a single heartbeat, pulsing through the world like a reminder that the cycle is unbroken. And maybe that is why Sonic always rises again. No matter how grim the battle, no matter how strong the foe, he does not rely on the rings as tools. He flows with them as companions. Shadows in the cycle. Yet not all find comfort in this eternal rhythm. Shadow the hedgehog, for example, feels its weight in a different way. For him, the scattering and returning of rings is a question of identity. If life can always begin again, if nothing is ever truly lost, then what does it mean to be unique, to be irreplaceable? Shadow's struggle mirrors the doubt that once haunted the civilizations of the lost interpretations. To him, the cycle feels less like rebirth and more like erasure, as though each scattering is proof that nothing is permanent, not even himself. But perhaps that is why Shadow's story continues. For while Sonic moves freely with the cycle, Shadow resists it, questions it, challenges it. In doing so, he reflects the part of us that fears impermanence. He embodies the truth that while the cycle is eternal, our hearts sometimes struggle to accept it. The cycles of the Chaos Emeralds. It is not only the rings that live in this eternal rhythm. The Chaos Emeralds, too, follow a similar dance of scattering and gathering. They vanish, hidden across the world. They are found, brought together, their light unleashed. And then they scatter again, always beyond the reach of those who would keep them forever. The rings, in their humble glow, mirror this same law. But where the Chaos Emeralds represent overwhelming bursts of power, the rings are subtler. They are the heartbeat to the emerald's thunderclap. They are the quiet glow beside the emerald's blinding brilliance. Both follow the cycle, but in different keys of the same song. Perhaps that is why they coexist, why the world holds both. The rings remind us that the cycle is not only about grand miracles. It is about the small, steady truths that carry us forward every day, the comfort of infinity. There is a strange kind of peace in knowing the cycle never ends. Though kingdoms fall, though heroes scatter, though villains rise and collapse, the rings endure. Imagine walking through a quiet meadow in Sonic's world. The grass sways, the wind hums, and there, above the earth, floats a simple golden circle, softly chiming, waiting. That ring has been there longer than the meadow, longer than the village nearby, longer than the stories told around fires. It will still be there long after those things are gone. And somehow, that is not frightening. It is calming. Because the rings remind us that while we may pass, while our stories may scatter, something of us will always remain, echoing in the cycle. Our courage, our endurance, our spark. The rings are more than survival tools. They are eternal companions, whispering in golden light that no end is ever truly final. Rings in memory. If you listen closely to the chime of a ring, you might begin to feel that it is not just energy, not just light, but memory. Every ring carries the echoes of those who touched it before. The courage of a hero who rose again. The fear of a wanderer who scattered them in the dark. The wonder of a child who reached out to touch the golden glow for the very first time. The rings are keepers of memory, but they never hold on to it for themselves. They release it, scatter it, pass it forward. Every time Sonic gathers a ring, he steps into an unbroken chain of stories that stretches back to the first spark and forward to futures not yet written. And so every ring he carries is more than a lifeline. It is a fragment of history, a reminder that others once walked the same path and left behind their courage for him to find. The eternal witness. In this way, The rings are like silent witnesses. They do not interfere. They do not choose sides. They simply appear when they are needed, glowing softly, patient and unchanging. Heroes rise, villains fall, temples crumble, kingdoms vanish. The stars shift, the seas rise, the forests change. But the rings remain. They have watched countless ages pass, and they will watch countless more. This is perhaps their greatest mystery. Not that they scatter, not that they return, but that they endure without ever losing themselves. Their glow is the same today as it was in the time of myths. Their chime is as steady now as it was when the first people gazed at them in awe. They are the heartbeat of Sonic's world, steady and timeless, even when everything else shifts, beyond ownership. If the lost interpretations taught us anything, it is that the rings cannot be owned. They do not belong to kings, to vaults, to empires. They do not belong to machines, nor to temples, nor even to heroes. They belong only to the cycle. This is their greatest gift. The freedom to always return. No matter how tightly someone tries to hold them, they slip away, only to appear again, shining and patient, ready for the next hand that needs them. The rings are free, and in their freedom, they teach us something profound, that the greatest power is not in possession, but in trust. Trust that the cycle will return what is lost. Trust that we can rise again. Trust that nothing is ever truly gone. The gentle endlessness. And so we return to the image that has carried us through this journey, the simple golden circle, glowing softly in the dark, a shape without beginning or end, a rhythm without finality, a light that scatters, returns forever. In this endlessness, there is peace. The rings remind us that even endings are only pauses, that even falls are only steps in a larger rhythm. They are the universe's way of whispering, rest, rise, repeat. For Sonic, for his friends, for the world itself, the rings are eternal companions, glowing fireflies that promise renewal, endurance, and the soft comfort of infinity. A dreamlike reflection. So if you close your eyes now, imagine the sound of rings chiming softly in the distance. Imagine them floating gently above quiet grass, glowing like stars fallen to the earth. Imagine them scattering in the wind, only to return brighter than before. Let that rhythm carry you. Let it remind you that even if today felt heavy, tomorrow is a new chance. Even if you scatter, you will gather again. Even if you fall, you will rise. The rings endure, and so will you. And with that, the story of the rings draws to a close. We have walked through their myths, their mysteries, their triumphs, and their shadows. From the first spark to the eternal cycle, they have shown us a truth as old as time. Nothing is ever truly lost. So, as you drift into sleep, let the soft glow of golden rings guide you. Imagine their endless rhythm, their scattering, their returning, their gentle promise of rebirth. Good night, and may your dreams be lit by the eternal cycle of gold.